Hello, welcome to the Midnight Hymn Podcast. This is episode number 2, and I'm Josh Foreman, and next to me is Eric and Ryan. I'm primarily a game designer and writer and artist. And Eric, introduce yourself real quick.
I'm Eric Soto. I primarily work in audio as well as other formats like video and film, and I also have a background in broadcasting and am a musician. So,
Cool. Ryan?
I'm just some dude in Texas and work in technology. That's about it. Not much else.
Nice. And what we do here on the podcast is we take a song from the band Virgin Black and scrutinize it. We analyze it. We love it so much and we overthink all about it. And if you're into that sort of thing, check it out. So why don't we go ahead and... there was one quick thing before we hop into the song. Ryan, you wanted to give a shout out. Why don't you do that?
Yeah, just wanted to give a shout out for folks to check out a YouTube channel called The Vocalist. That's The Vocal, and it's YST at the end. She does a lot of reaction videos. She's quite popular. Lot of views. She does very popular bands like Tool, Metallica, jazz music, and she's a trained vocalist from Nashville. Has a very extensive music background, and I've really enjoyed getting to meet her. And she's got a Patreon, so check it out. One of these days, we hope to maybe get her on here and have her join us. We could certainly use a non-male perspective. So if anyone else is interested, reach out to us.
Yeah, awesome. Oh, and we actually did want to give one other really big shout out. Ryan, why don't you give a potted story about the last episode?
Yeah, so Dark Escapes is the music band that Virgin Black's associated with, and we had a lot of issues.
Music label.
Excuse me, the music label.
Yeah,
we had a lot of issues with YouTube and copyright claims, and Seska, I'd reach out to her and she gave us the name of Michael Lobb, and Michael Lobb was incredible. I mean, if the music industry could duplicate this human being, I mean, the world would be a better place. So
imagine if the industry was filled with people who are actually fans of music and cared about it. Oh man, what a world.
right.
So check out Dark Escapes, and hopefully you can find some new music there.
Cool. All right, let's hop right into the song. This is another epic one. We tend to gravitate towards those. So this is from the album Requiem Mezzo Forte, and it is called In Death. So let's listen to that now. Well, what do we think?
Yeah, where to start on this one? This one's interesting because, you know, who wants to think about misery and wretchedness? It's not a thought that you necessarily embrace every day. And so, it's like, where do you begin with that? What's interesting in my view, and Josh, I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, Eric. It seems like misery is, and we've all discussed this in our notes, it seems to be a character that exists in this song rather than necessarily a personal experience. I want to pause there and see how you guys sort of initially approach this.
Eric, you first.
Yeah, talking about how I approach wretchedness, or that.
Well,
that
just this, what does the song leave you with? Just high level impressions.
however, I mean, it's great because it starts with that somber string quartet, and a great gives it kind of that cinematic quality that you would find in modern films. So it's just it takes you through that story of darkness and dealing with kind of death, either as you can talk about death literally or more figuratively, dealing with that um, somber emotions and that depression, working through that, and then kind of at the end there's kind of a more redemptive feeling, trying to pull yourself out of that and bring yourself to a different place.
Yeah, I think the word cinematic is going to come up a lot because that's definitely a lot of what's going on here. Um, I think I would love to have a full podcast dedicated to kind of the history of the influences that go into this genre in general, and like what we're picking up on in Virgin Black in particular. So I probably want to put that to the side, otherwise we'd completely derail it. I think the one important thing that I do want to talk about is some of the context of this song in this album, in a trilogy of albums, late in late Virgin Black's career. And so the one thing to note about this, unlike the last song, so in episode 1 we covered Museum of Iscariot, which was very broad ranging. Like, it told a narrative. It had lots of themes, lots of movements. And this musically does a lot of similar things, but thematically it's almost one note as far as what it's talking about and the approach to it. But I think what's important to note is the reason it's doing that is because it's part of a trilogy. This is like one part of a much larger body of work. So it gives you time to breathe with an idea for a long time, and that's I think what makes the song really interesting, and many of the songs around it too, and the whole album in a sense, right? So that's important context to think about here.
Yeah, I think the other context, Josh, is this is a requiem, and which is a rites for the dead. I believe I haven't looked it up in a while, but it's a three-piece requiem, and Virgin Black is notorious for linking their songs. And thematically, if you look at their predecessor album, that's the first piece of the requiem. It's called Pianissimo. It's entirely classical. The sibling to In Death is called Until Death. So those two songs are, in my view, linked. Until Death comes first, and then In Death second. So we're not going to play Until Death. You can check out the lyrics, but just something to observe.
Yeah.
That's really awesome. I didn't think about it in terms of the trilogy, but that's important context. And I'd say this is probably one of my favorites in that trilogy. Just the way that it combines kind of their earlier metal style with some of their more stuff that has more string quartets and stuff. Like
Yeah,
that.
Mezzo Forte is pretty much
Romantic.
regarded as a diamond in the rough, 9 out of 10 type album. I mean, it's gotten a lot of accolades. So
Yeah, rightly so. So one of the thematic things I think is worth talking about is, because Virgin Black tends to work in lyrically and thematically in like very spiritual language and stuff, is, and coming from kind of the Judeo-Christian background, the nearest a parallel to the themes here would be the book of Ecclesiastes, which is full of this kind of just dwelling on darkness, futility, death, misery, etc., that sort of thing. So, I don't know how much of that is purposefully pulled into this. As far as I can tell, there's no like one-to-one allusions to that text in particular, but the vibe is very much there.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking about this song, and there was one day I was laying in my bed. It was right after October 7th last year when, the Middle East started to erupt. And somehow this song came on, and I was just empathizing with the people in the Middle East. And this song came on, and man, it just really activated me. If you think of the lyrics, there is a lot of misery in the world. And the word wretchedness, people may not realize, especially in the Christian tradition, where there's, the word wretched or I am a wretch. It's not so much applying to me personally or what's inside of me in the context of total depravity and sinner and all that. It's the word itself, wretched, means in a very unhappy or unfortunate state.
Yeah.
So I just think it's important to go back to the roots of what wretchedness means, because a lot of people associate it with maybe a kind of self-contempt or less than human experience.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things, I was perusing through Ecclesiastes. It is one of my favorite books in the Bible, probably because I just kind of have that bent, that darkness. um, but some of the things that are related that it reminded me of are in Ecclesiastes. There's a line that goes, "What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind." And then another place it says, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." And then another one I really like is, "For there's a proper time and procedure for every manner, through every person may be, or though every person may be weighed down by misery. I have seen real misery here on earth. Money saved is a curse to its owners. They lose it all in a bad deal and have nothing to give their children. People come into this world with nothing, and when they die, they leave with nothing. In spite of all their hard work, they leave just as they came." So yeah, I mean, you can tell that similar vibe, right? This thing about, "Oh misery, you live. I have been struck, and I am suffering," and that's just dwelling on that is an interesting exercise. It's an interesting practice, because it hits so differently for different people at different times in their lives who are in different circumstances. For one person, it could be very healthy. For other people, it can be very destructive. I'm curious what you guys think about those kind of, downer thoughts and and phrases and literature and stuff like that. Eric, how do you deal with this kind of material?
I mean, I obviously grew up like you did, like on reading the Old Testament and those parts of Ecclesiastes. I'm sure those have inspired so many different songs. Like I immediately, the first one you quoted about chasing the wind, immediately thought of As I Lay Dying, because they have at least one or two songs that
Yeah.
are related to that. So I mean, it's inspired so many different kind of songs. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously coming from a very real place, a lot of that, but I can also be a little bit over the top, kind of how it's conveyed, just kind of being down on everything. But it's finding that, I guess, that middle ground, between acknowledging like real feelings and of like, oh, the world should be different, and this, dealing with the sorrow and, like you said, the wretchedness. You're trying to deal with those emotions, but also, not letting yourself dwell there. And so I think that's kind of my reaction to that, is that sometimes that can pull you down if you get too into that emotion. But
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
Yeah.
one thing that
people
occurs.
perceive it differently, whether how much it inspires them, or like, oh, this kind of makes me depressed, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so much dependent on, what is the purpose of, exploring this area. is it to wallow? I mean, and I'm not even judging that. I mean, sometimes wallowing may be part of a process that you have to go through, and sometimes it's for other purposes. What are your thoughts on these kind of dark themes, Ryan?
For me in my own life, I tend to think of it as, how do I befriend misery and sorrow and wretchedness? And by befriend, again, it's not to wallow. It's think of, like I said, when you're a kid and you go underwater and you start holding your breath. The more you do that, the more your capacity to hold your breath longer increases. And so when I think of these things, misery, it's really just distress in my life. And how do I sit with that distress versus react, versus pursuing sort of behaviors that may seek to numb it, avoid it, or ways I might live in a false self. And so that's kind of how I approach it, is an opportunity to consider it and sit with it rather than wallow in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole concept of metaphorical death, I mean, is interesting. Like you said, if you're dividing that from a physical death, but obviously that comes up in the Bible a lot. Death and resurrection, those themes, but it also comes up in so many other things as well. Like I don't read the Bible as much these days, being my spiritual beliefs, but I'm more into like the tarot, and death is its own card in there that kind of gets stereotyped as, oh, it's a bad card, and it's not necessarily from that angle. It's more what comes before, like new life, essentially. Like this dark period you might have to, in Jungian terms, like deal with your own shadow, deal with those things around you that are dark, and then kind of move forward towards like a different phase. So it's kind of just part of the cyclical thing.
Yeah, that is a common theme in many religions for sure. I mean, you think of Shiva, who's both death and rebirth, and yeah, that whole like karmic cycle and all those kind of things where these things are inextricably linked. And to talk about one is whether you're acknowledging it or not is to implicitly evoke the other in some way. So
Right.
I'll sort of with transition out of this first phase. I I really love "There Is No Healing, Balm of Reason."
There is no
I just think the beginning is so freaking powerful for a song. It's probably one of my best or most favorite sort of verses in this entire album. It's just beautifully sung. It's got such powerful emotion to it. But I'll end with Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of my favorite authors ever. And he has this quote: "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The really great people must, I think, have great sadness on earth." And so that just really resonates with me. Sadness isn't, a bad thing to avoid. It has sort of healing properties to it, a kind of saltiness, perhaps.
yeah, no, that's great insight. That the more you know, in a sense, the more you have to be aware of how much injustice and suffering there is in the world, within yourself, within all these systems that we operate. So, yeah, that's a good insight. So as far as like the song goes, yeah, we should not just tangent off into just about the themes, but specifically on the song, I think it's interesting. I was noting it's mostly talking about this entity of misery, but as the music, the movements come and go, you get different perspectives on the same topic, which I think is really neat. Specifically, one of my favorite parts is the drums that come in at about 3 minutes, and to me they sound kind of like the military marching drums. That when back when people would line up in orderly rows and march towards each other and shoot. It's kind of got that, or a military tribunal or something along those lines, right? It gives me that martial feeling. And yeah, I'm curious, what are the different music movements evoke in you guys?
That's definitely one that I really like, because it really starts to give that transition from the slower kind of like initial sadness and moving it towards kind of the more epic parts. Obviously with all the guitars and everything, but I looked that up and I thought there was like a more complex term for that, the military style drumming there, and it's just called a march rhythm typically, or a march. So, yeah, it's so you see that come up in film music so much, and it really brings that cinematic quality in there.
Yeah, it seems to be like a kind of preparation. Obviously, we have sort of the part that comes after that, but I don't want to skip over. Right when the song gets heavy, we have what's called a chiasmus, which is a literary technique to typically use to emphasize something. And if you guys recall in the lyrics, "O wretchedness, O misery, set thy altar here, fall upon mercy." Um, I can't remember the next line, but then it reaches the center of the chiasmus, which is lifeless life cradles lifeless death, and then it follows afterwards the same lines above.
Yeah, set thy
So
altar here, fall upon mercy, O wretchedness. Yeah. So basically, it becomes an echo of itself in a sense. What I'll do is I'll put on the screen right now an image to clarify this concept, and we could put a link in the description too about that. So
yeah, so typically when formal people kind of deconstruct a chiasmus, they write symbols, and so in this case we have A B C B A. And what's really interesting in my mind, and this may be a complete figment of my imagination, but I like patterns, and I like looking for patterns. And if you go down, you have A B C B A. It's actually A B C B prime A, because the B is actually slightly reversed. But then if you zoom into that C, it's got a horizontal chiasmus. So it's like two chiasmuses embedded in one. And the letter C in the center, if you go left to right, it's 1 2 3 1 minus 2. Lifeless life cradles lifeless death. Death and life being opposites. So 2 and minus 2 is typically how it's structured in chiasmus. And so if you really zoom out and you really look at this, you have a vertical axis, and then in the center you have a horizontal, which forms the image of a cross. And so I find that really interesting.
that's some galaxy brain writing going on there.
I wouldn't put it past Rowan and Seska to embed something like that, but it's more than likely a figment of my imagination. But I just found it interesting.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, I kind of had a mind blown moment when I saw that, thinking about it. Go ahead, Eric. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, you're fine. It immediately made me start thinking of geometry, and then as a phrase in the spiritual tradition of Kabbalah goes, like everything is connected to everything else. So, yeah, definitely you can connect that to lyrical styles, how songs are structured, and
yeah. How do you guys deal with this sort of, I don't know, fulcrum of the song? Lifeless life cradles lifeless death. What does that mean to you? Josh, you kind of activated me on X, with one of your posts, and I commented, but I want to save my thoughts for last. I want to hear from you guys.
It is one that I've pondered many times, and to me, so when you negate a phrase with its own statement, as in lifeless life, and then pair that with lifeless death, that lifeless is doing something really interesting, because in the latter, in lifeless death, that is redundant, assuming you take the words at their face value, which clearly you cannot in this kind of context. So yeah, what is that life that is lifeless? And there are lots of, so the place my mind goes is false life, kind of false consciousness. This idea that I have figured something out. I have the life. I've discovered it, or whatever, along those lines. This ideology must be correct and is giving me life. And there are versions of that, certainly, which are lifeless. Jesus talks about, by their fruit you shall know them, which is why I think there are far more atheists who are better Christians than there are Christians who are good Christians. As in there are
Couldn't give you a stronger amen to that.
there are ways of living that produces, love, kindness, goodness, patience, all those things. And there are ways that people insist are life that don't. And so, yeah, that's where my mind goes.
Yeah, along the same lines of what you're saying is, I mean, probably from a little bit different angle, but you have two polarities of life, or I mean, there's more than one way to live life, obviously, but a life that's actually full of things that are beautiful and give you meaning, and then on the other side, one where you're just going through the motions. So I don't know, it makes me think of those two polarities of like whether you're being present in life or not. If that makes sense. Are you present? Are you living through life in a meaningful way, or is it just kind of you're just going through the motions? And one kind of holds the other, in kind of this balance of like, oh, I have to go through this phase of grief, which is what the song talks about, is going through a really grief-filled period, but then
visually it makes me think of the yin yang, right? Like, especially the cradling aspect of it specifically.
Yeah, I think you guys have captured. I mean, number one, to cradle, I thought of, a mother, cradling a baby, and it's almost like you have this pendulum swinging. And I agree, when I thought about lifeless life, I really thought about sort of autopilot mode, sleepwalking, going through life unconscious, where you're just sort of attached to this matrix, and you're living, at least in the West, in America, we're living in this, capitalistic system, and we just kind of like hamsters on a wheel a lot of our lives. And we find outlets or things to do that sort of distract us, and we span years. That's my lifeless life sort of angle. And then when you shift over to lifeless death, I'm thinking about, I don't know, in psychology, what they call maladaptive behaviors, that kind of rob me from finding growth or meaning, in forms of suffering. I mean, again, not something we want to think about or talk about, but a lot of what we experience, at least in my life, can, for a number of years was expressed in maladaptive behaviors. So that brought me a lot of pain. So that's my kind of take. I did think of a movie quote from Shawshank Redemption and Andy Dufresne when he says, I guess it comes down to a simple choice, really. Get busy living or get busy dying. And that line really came to me when I was thinking about this particular lifeless life, cradles lifeless death.
Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. All right, so we've got giant pages of notes. So I just want to open the floor for any other topics that any of you guys feel particularly excited about as regards this song, music or lyrics.
Well, it's interesting because it transitions into Latin and it really picks up. Like there's this, sort of tremor, earthquake sound. That, the whole song is sort of building up towards. And, the Exode Oratiorum is, "O Lord, hear my prayer." Actually, it's just "hear my prayer, hear me." And then "Quantos tremor est futurus" is "what a trembling there will be." And it seems like that's the main crescendo of the song is "Quantos tremor est futurus," what a trembling there will be. I mean, they had experienced a loss of some form. And so that's what sort of inspired them to write this, I believe. But the song ends with, the hour of parting is at hand. I mean, any point in time, any one of us on this podcast could be gone. Tomorrow, a year. I mean, knock on wood. But
it could happen during this podcast. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. I think that's more depressing than, thinking about misery. So,
all right. And Eric, you had a thing about music or something. Please go into it.
Oh yeah. More towards the end of the song, you kind of have the drums that build up the tension with the string section, and it kind of reaches kind of this climax right before like this eerie chant starts coming in.
Mhm.
You found it when I was hearing it, listening to it the other day, it was making me think of Dune. It's one of the parts where they have like the soldiers outside and they're doing like
The
this
newer Dune movie, I assume, not the 1986 or
yeah, it
whatever.
was
Yeah.
one of the, I can't remember if it was the part two or the part one, but they have the and it's like a very low droning chant.
Mm.
Uh, so I thought that part was interesting. Like it kind of takes you out of like part of the other parts of the song, and it's almost like uh, entering the underworld in kind of a metaphorical sense
Yeah.
too. So I guess that kind of relates to different layers of emotion being related to different textures in the music itself. Like each phase kind of uh, going through a different part of dealing with grief in a sense.
Yeah, I like that. The different musical textures and vocal textures relating to elements of the theme. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's true. There's a part where Susan Johnson, who is the soprano here, is doing that. Uh, I don't know what that's called, but that sort of thing. You just heard my amazing singing there. But yeah, that part actually reminded me very much. Pro tip: if anyone's a fan of Virgin Black, you will like the soundtrack to Bram Stoker's Dracula from '93, I think it was. Yeah, very similar vibes at that end part. But yeah, that where you have all these different textures interweaving, and I think that's one of the things that I love about Virgin Black so much is that that is like their thing. They just take all these disparate elements and find ways to weave them together. Just it feels effortlessly. It's like when you watch Bob Ross painting, and he's just like dab dab dab, happy little trees, and you're like, oh, that's so easy, I could do that. But you get oil paints, and no, you can't just do that.
Yeah, another, I don't know, observation. It's really not that big of a deal, but they have the line, "I've been struck and I am suffering," and that's not just in this song. It's in, there's another song called "And I Am Suffering," and they have an amazing, "The fangs of suffering have tear my bosom." But in this song, the second occurrence where they sing "I've been struck and I am suffering" is it's really interesting. They sing the word suffering and it lasts 6 seconds long from the time they start it to the time they end it. And it's just really, man, the way they draw it out, it's so potent. I think I just found that interesting. I was like, as I was preparing for this, I decided to just check it out, and yeah, it took 6 seconds to sing that word.
It's almost related to almost like thinking about a scream, like you're letting out all that emotion for like a long period of time. Instead, you're actually giving the word or how you're feeling, what you're going through.
Yeah, totally.
That's what that makes me think of.
Okay. Any last thoughts before we wrap up?
I think the final thought, Josh and Eric, is I mentioned the Middle East, and if you look at Spotify, there's actually Turkey is the number one country that plays their music on a monthly basis.
Okay.
And there was an article published in The Atlantic, which is a very reputable, a magazine. You have to have a subscription. Most people have heard of the Atlantic. It's up there with the New Yorker and other things. They wrote an article in 2011, I believe, about Syrian metal is at war or something. And it was a story about these people in Syria that were going through the whole sort of civil war and upheaval during that era. And it's called Surviving Syria's Civil War with Heavy Metal. And it's about this guy, Manzur Darwish, who created this documentary of the same name. And it was about literally how people were getting slaughtered around them. It was awful. I mean, talk about misery and wretchedness. And they found Virgin Black, and the metal community came together. And this Atlantic article calls out Seska and Virgin Black, is how meaningful and comforting their music was. And it's just interesting, like when you think of the word comforting against the backdrop of misery and wretchedness, but then if you put yourself in the shoes of a young Palestinian kid, or an Israeli family that just got kidnapped on October 7th, or people in Syria, it's kind of potent. And the fact that they found comfort in this, and they found some sense of community, I just found really interesting and profound. So that's my final thought, Josh.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, music can definitely help give us comfort in darker times like that. So
Yeah, at some point in a future episode, we'll have to talk about very personal interactions with with their music and what it meant in our lives and stuff. But I think this is a good place to call it for this episode. And it's been great. Thanks everyone for joining. And if you just found out about Virgin Black for the first time, welcome. We'd love to talk to you. Leave comments below.
Yeah, we haven't got a comment, although we did get 124 views.
Yeah.
So it exceeded our 5.
Practically
quota.
Mr. Beast here. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. Elon Musk is going to be reaching out to us soon. I have no doubts.
For sure.
All right. Later, guys. Enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Signing off. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.